Welcome to the Genre Hustle, your virtual sci-fi fantasy writers group. I'm Anton.
I'm Jane.
I'm Chris.
I'm Lucy.
And I'm Chelsea.
And today we're talking about setting and what it means, and particularly kind of the importance of setting in science fiction and fantasy. So who wants to explain setting to our audience? Who wants to say?
Well, first of all, as genre writers, fantasy and sci-fi writers, it's super important. People go to these books partially to read about exotic places and times and, far-flung galaxies and crazy fantastical land. So, and part of the joy of writing it also is coming up with these. So I think particularly for sci-fi and fantasy, it's a very important topic.
Right. And Lucy, you were talking about kind of before we got on mic about this, I guess, the concept of escapism, or the idea of sort of the deeper meaning of setting for the genre.
I think that it's particularly important. I think that sci-fi and fantasy comes in and out of fashion. At certain points in time, if you look throughout history, it's especially when there are major conflicts going on, you'll see a rise in science fiction and fantasy. And I think that says a lot about what it does for people. It allows them to escape into a world that is not the real world. It provides fun, entertainment, just like people visit the cinema more when there's a recession because it's an escape. And I think so. It's not only fun, which it is. It's very important for people. It plays a very, very important role in people's lives.
It's one of the draws, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like a big part of the fun of fantasy is setting. It's the horses and the swords and the cool mountain ranges and stuff. But also it's, how does that reinforce theme? How does that reinforce character? And so I think, the big thing that we're here to talk about is beyond the fun, like how do you get setting to do more work for your story?
Right.
So when we talk about setting, what is it we're actually talking about?
Well, first of all, where it's taking place. Is it an urban setting? Is it taking place in a city? Is it taking place in the countryside?
Right. Is it a spaceship somewhere out in space? It is a moon base. Is it Is it a dangerous place to be, or is it soothing and calm? Is it like home, or is it throwing the character into a position of being uncomfortable all right.
the time?
And it can be big or it can be small. It can be the hull of a ship, or it could be, an open field stretching to the horizon. I mean, I think setting is the whole story, is where the whole story takes place, I guess, in a sentence.
Yeah, I was going to say I think there's macro and micro level settings. Like in the Hunger Games, the macro level setting of that world is impacting what Katniss experiences on a day-to-day basis, but she moves throughout her day-to-day world, even though I guess normies or, the reader, it's still a dangerous place. She has to go hunt and it's impoverished. She's very comfortable there, and she really only moves into discomfort and danger as she gets closer to the capital, which is also more civilized.
Yeah, and the place, Hunger Games is such a great example, I think, for setting, because the games themselves take place in this artificial battle royale arena, right? Which is so cool. imaginatively built.
And I think that it does a lot of work because it's obviously explicitly science fiction, but it also kind of, I think, harkens back to fantasy a little bit, because fantasy, especially epic fantasy, tends to lean very heavily on natural settings, and and the danger implicit in those settings.
So if we're talking about setting as more than just where the story takes place, I think a good place to start is this idea of setting an atmosphere, or setting as theme, or setting as tone. And I guess, real quick, the idea there is that the setting in the story is doing more than just telling the reader, oh, this is a fantasy world, or this is a moon base, or whatever. It's actually helping to give some kind of feel to the story, and allowing the reader to kind of sort of an entryway into the story. And is this going to be, is it a dark and dismal place, or is it foreboding? It is a light and airy place where the characters are going to feel safe. And so I think that's a big thing that setting can do.
Well, I think to go to that point, one of the things that your job as a writer is to pick certain things in the setting to describe that do those things, that set up theme, set up how the character is feeling. So like, if you're on a space station, you may choose to describe how the gravity feels. Is the character sort of in their journey in the story, is the character sort of like up in the air a little bit like out of sorts? Maybe by choosing to describe the lack of gravity there, can go to the theme or to the spot of the story the character's in, for example.
And I think the biggest thing for me is how your character, and you do this so well in your writing, how they interpret the setting. So, okay, it's one level just to have your character describe what's going on with the gravity, but it's another to have that character respond in his own personal specific way to the gravity. So if he's scared by it, if he's unnerved, if he's excited by it, tells us so much about who that character is and what journey they're on, I think.
Yeah, something that I just read was The Goblin Emperor, which Jane, it's really good. And the really interesting thing about that character is that, this isn't really spoiling anything because it's in the title, as he becomes the emperor. He becomes the emperor. So he's instantly surrounded by this opulent, just over the top brocaded, everything is in jewels and silk and gold. And he's surrounded by this bevy of servants. And the servants are kind of trying to make themselves part of the setting by saying like, no, your majesty or your serenity, I can't be your friend. I have to just be your servant. And the emperor is like constantly sort of reaching out and trying to pull them out of the setting to make personal connections with them. And there's a really interesting tension with that character and with the setting as the book progresses, because he goes from incredibly uncomfortable and only holding his meetings in this one the least opulent meeting room, to starting to navigate the grander palace and use specific rooms for specific purposes.
And I think that brings up another great point, Chelsea, which is that setting is more than just a physical aspect of your world, because I would say the Goblin Emperor setting is also about the kind of political relationships among other people at the court that he has to navigate.
Absolutely.
As if it were, a hostile storm. Right?
Yeah, and it's just as labyrinthine as the palace itself. He keeps getting lost.
Yeah.
Daniel Abraham does that with the Dagger and the Coin series, because they're constantly traveling between these two cities. And I know the capital city is this sort of oppressive place with this giant tower where moving through it is, it's this idea of oppression, whereas there's these other cities that are sort of open and airy and stuff. So the setting is huge in those stories in the same sort of way.
And earlier, Anton, you had mentioned instances where the character is in harmony with the setting and instances where the character is in conflict with the setting. So I was wondering if we wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's another really interesting storytelling device.
Chelsea was talking about that too, right? This idea that that setting can actually help to heighten the emotions for the character. I think if I'm saying
exactly.
Right.
So I kind of like to tackle settings sometimes, like when I'm thinking about it in the forefront. I don't always write setting first, like, how am I going to read the theme into the... No. Not everybody does that. But I do like to think about, how is the setting making my character comfortable or uncomfortable? Yeah. If my character is comfortable in a sword fight, what does that say about her versus her comfort in a fancy ball, in a fancy ball gown? So like my first scene of Broken Blades is Hawk on top of a building watching a hanging and waiting to shoot the rope to save her friend from being hung. And then so up on the roof, she feels very comfortable and very confident. Her plan is going to go off, and this is going to be perfect. And as soon as the plan doesn't go off and she's down on the ground, her power structure, her relationship to the setting has changed, and her relationship to the geography has changed. So now she's the one who's being surrounded, as opposed to her adversaries. Mm-hmm. And so she's very on the back foot and she's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's a great way to build in conflict. And I'm thinking of some stories where the setting, in a way, is the primary antagonist, like The Martian.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, that's a great example, right? Or horror stories, right? Because if it's the haunted house or something like that. I mean, the setting itself is the antagonist. The character is up against a place.
It's also a box of clues in a way, especially for horror stories. The first thing that goes wrong is that the doll's head turns around and then a door slams closed. And so you're
just talking
as
about
the
my dating
reader, are
life
engaged in the little bread trail of crumbs that the author has given you, trying to figure out what the big sinister thing is happening.
Yeah, but again, that's all exterior to the character, but it's all going to the definitely the atmosphere. Obviously, I mean, it's foreboding and sinister,
and the emotion,
but then it's also going to the emotion, right? Because the character is frightened or intrigued, or it strengthens their resolve because they've got to get through this thing or whatever.
And that's why I think it's so important when you're thinking about engaging the reader in the story and putting down clues for them and using the setting to help tell the story. It's so important to pick unique details. I think it's so easy to get wrapped up in what the characters are doing, what the conflict is, that you can pick the obvious ones, like the door slamming or the chair leg scraping, or he put his elbows on the hard table. And I think when you really sit down and think about what is in the room and pick unique things that would only be specific to your setting and no one else's, I think it's definitely a way to bring a scene to life and make it different.
Yeah, and then think about how one character is going to interact with those setting details versus another character. One character might feel very at home and in their cluttered sub-basement apartment, Harry Dresden surrounded by all of his stuff, and then other characters come in and they're like, oh my god, you live in a cave? This horrible dank, it's cold and it's a sub-basement and there's no windows, and he's like, what? This is my home. This is normal.
And to zoom out a little bit from the sort of character interaction with setting, I think we can also talk about the story theme interaction with setting.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually brought in an example from my own writing.
Awesome.
Oh
my God, do you write?
To illuminate this point.
Oh, you just happen to have it right there?
I just happen to have it right here. So this is a quick scene from my book, The Runner, and it's set in a repair shop. And the main character, Roger, is an android, a drug-dealing android called a runner, and he does not want to be in this repair shop at all. So I'm just going to read it real quick and then explain how I think it relates to theme and all this stuff. So the shop was as disorderly as Granger's appearance. Cables were jumbled on the floor, draped over hooks, and poked out from a trash receptacle like rat tails. A couple even hung from the light fixtures overhead. Pieces of machinery lay in piles, spent gas canisters lined the walls, and prehistoric touchscreens were stacked precariously here and there, some of which had given into the inevitable and collapsed into disordered sloughs. There were drudges stationed at various spots in the room, dust-covered and broken down. A runner's head sat propped against a wall. It was a relic, not particularly realistic-looking, a Hispanic model with brown skin and a missing eye. It grinned with lips parted, showing just the tips of the teeth, forever frozen. So in this scene, for me, what was important here was, in describing the room, is to go to theme. And one of the big themes of the book is not just what it means to be human or what that is, but also how easily we can get dehumanized in our culture. And so in this scene, Roger is uncomfortable in this place. It's jumbled. The thing he focuses on is the head of this runner, which is literally disembodied,
right,
and dehumanized. And it's a reminder to him that he is actually, even though he thinks of himself as human in a way, it's a reminder that the people around him and the society around him do not. So that's like my example, a little heavy-handed, perhaps, but like my way of kind of going, okay, I'm going to use this description to set the scene, but also to talk about Roger's emotional state and the bigger themes of the book.
Well, yeah, and I think there's, beyond what you pointed out, there's two smaller details in there. You talk about the cables poking out of the trash can like rat's tails, which to me kind of speaks to the conflict between organic and inorganic that that you work towards. And then also that the android's face is frozen in this kind of like creepy sort of half grin. I was trying to do it while you were reading, like, how do you exactly,
I don't know.
Showing that like he that Roger can be sort of manipulated and put into this like a false emotion of happiness, or that maybe our emotions are masks that we use. There's a lot there. And I thought that was really interesting that you chose a grin instead of a grimace, or just a blank expression, or nothing,
I think it's the classic showing, not telling. You're using the setting to show what's going on in a bigger sense in the story and on a character level, rather than have the character tell us what's going on, which is what we're striving for as writers, because a reader learns nothing when you tell them what's going on, but if you allow them to engage in the story and figure it out themselves, then that's what reading's all about.
And setting can also engage not only with theme, but also I think with symbolism, and especially sort of visual symbols, but also just symbolism in general. And you think about, the tagline from Game of Thrones, "Winter is coming." Like, yes, it's literally coming, but symbolically,
Right.
It's an age of violence and aggression and war and deprivation that's coming. Right. And the fact that it's the Stark's motto is also very, I think, significant. And I think the way that George R.R. Martin sort of makes use of setting to sort of set up these giant, big, epic symbols, I think, is really interesting.
Absolutely.
And I think it all does go to, like you were saying, Jane, it does go to the symbolism and the bigger ideas in the story. And I think, Chris, what you were doing there is going to the bigger ideas. Number one, the specificity. It's easy for you to say. Is key, because I think we've talked about this before, where you don't just list things, and especially in settings, you don't just come in and say, here was a messy room and there was stuff stacked here and there was wires hanging up there. It's that next level of, what does it mean emotionally? What does it mean to the character? How do you connect the scene, the setting to the character and make it mean something? Not just, he was in a room and here's what the room looked like, because that doesn't do anything. That goes to your point, Lucy. It's just, you're just telling the reader, hey, there's a bunch of stuff in the room.
Right. I mean, in a perfect world, every specific that you're going to choose to write about and call out is going to have deeper meanings. So you should be able to look at it on different levels.
Yeah.
Hopefully. I mean, in a long novel, maybe not every single one.
Not everyone works.
But
we're not trying to write the Great Gatsby here either. Like,
we are trying.
everything is burdened with glorious symbolism.
Speak
over
for
and
yourself.
Over. I don't want to have to write another essay or ever think about again the billboard with like the eye and the tear on the road.
The green light at the end.
Yeah,
of the
thank you.
Perhaps
Whatever
we
that
could
is.
all try to write Tender as the Night instead.
Do we want to?
So is there a difference in writing setting for sci-fi and fantasy?
Well,
No.
for me,
All right. Hey, that was a good discussion.
yeah.
Good job, everyone.
So for me, no, I don't think so. I think I personally approach setting the same way in terms of the kinds of questions I ask myself about why I'm choosing this setting, whether I'm writing sci-fi, fantasy, romance, or a contemporary lit fic. I think for me, the questions are the same.
And what are the questions?
Yeah, I was just going to
How
say,
do you
let's put
approach
you
it?
on the spot.
So I think one question is, it's sort of what we talked about. What is the setting saying about what I want to say with this story? And I think it's especially important, don't you find, and I'd be curious to hear other people too, like at the very beginning, right? Like that opening scene, because it's the first impression you make on your reader. It's a chance for your setting to hint at a lot of things like themes and symbols that you might want to explore, as well as, if you can, maybe the central conflict that the story is going to be about.
Well, I know for me, the setting always comes in first, in sort of in the macro sense, in terms of where in the world is the story set. And, for like the Varja stories, I always think about, all right, where are we going to do this? Is it in the woods? Is it in a castle? Is it in a city? Is it in an iron mine? Like, where are we? And then I immediately think about, okay, what can I do with that?
There's going to be a story in an iron mine?
Yeah, the one I'm doing now.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
It's called Varja and the Candy Mountain. It's,
That's what Chris calls
that's what
it.
I always call it. I'm waiting for that one.
I think I may approach things the same way, Anton. I became really interested when I wrote my current book about this area of London, Brixton, the gangs that were hanging out there, the changing landscape, the gentrification. And I was thinking the same thing. What story would be interesting to see take place in that world, and what would that say about how the political atmosphere is affecting people? I think I may approach things in the same direction.
I kind of agree too, actually. Like for me, sometimes setting kind of can drive the story. Like I always feel like setting for me is very important. One of the things I really like is when the setting is almost a character in the story, where it's so palpable, that has a personality. And like I think I've told some of you guys this story before, but when I was writing The Runner, I actually like got in my car and I drove around Hollywood. Because I was like, I really like was interested in like really, it didn't have to be exactly like true to life, but I wanted to like get some ideas of what to put in there. And I drove around and I found this, I think it was on Formosa or something, the China King restaurant. And it ended up, I didn't know what it was going to be, but I was like, that is a shitty looking restaurant.
That's the Ono bar, right?
What a hellhole. No, it's not the Ono bar, but in the Runner, I have the scene where Roger runs away and he ends up spending the night in this little sort of drug den, and it's the old China King restaurant, which is boarded up.
Oh, funny.
And it's just like that got me to the scene rather than vice versa.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know, like if any of you guys have experiences like that, where something like that you see or something is a springboard for a story or a scene.
Yeah, I got lost in the port of Long Beach once, which is easy to do, just driving around. And like you can't see anything because there's stacks and stacks of containers and the cranes and big rigs, and all the big rigs know where they're going. You do not know where you are going. And Google Maps is confused. Siri is telling you like driving to the ocean, proceed to the route. I'm like, I can't. And so like that kind of sense of like claustrophobia informed the climax of Terromancer, which takes place at the port, because everything that is surrounding Beth is so much bigger than she is, and also threatening to crash down on her.
It's such a surreal place too, that port.
Yeah, it's weird. And I tend to support or approach setting, like when I'm writing fantasy, I like, please don't be angry with me, I like tropes. I like
Am I
so
right?
angry with you.
I like a like a tavern.
I'll support your tropes if you support my symbolism.
Sure. And my tavern isn't a symbol, but it is just a tavern. And so like I like taverns and ancient temples, and I like to write a dungeon crawl and stuff like that. And but then I also think about like what is the geography, both emotionally and like if I were going to just like sketch this thing out, what does it look like? Are my characters on a really busy street surrounded by tall buildings, and it's kind of feeling a little claustrophobic and anybody could spot them at any time? Are they in a comfortable tavern that is somehow uncomfortable for another reason, like it's been abandoned, and it's a place that like it used to be their Cheers, but now it's abandoned and it's been ransacked, and so it's like it took a happy place and made it shitty.
Now it's like a real Cheers.
Yeah, which has been bought by TGI Fridays.
Think sometimes it's about reinforcing things to readers, because people are simple in many ways. And I think, especially, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, I mean, especially when they're coming new to a story, you somehow need to communicate what you have in your head to them. And that's not always easy to do. If you just have two characters in a room talking with each other, it's going to be twice as hard to pick up on what their state of mind is if you don't have a setting that's telling you, oh, these people are very wealthy, or these people are very poor, or, it's helping you just explain to the reader what the hell's going on in their lives.
Without having the character go, God, I'm poor.
I'm so poor. I can't afford butter. Yeah.
So you bring up a really good point. I see a lot among like new writers, younger writers. I think we've all probably done this, the floating head syndrome, right? Where you have characters talking and you're like, where are they?
Yeah,
what's going on? What's their physical what?
Yeah,
are they in
I had this one scene
Like
I had this one scene where he was like my main character. It was like my first epic fantasy, and it was too big for me. That's why I stopped writing it, because it was just too big. And like he was in this brothel and describing like how opulent and wonderful and luxurious it was. And like, a page and a half later, I'm like, wow, this is great.
Yeah.
and all my readers were like, I skipped all that.
Yeah, nothing happened. There was no drama.
So that's like the other side, is that there's too much setting. And I will say one more sort of cautionary thing that I've also seen, and I'm sure I've done, is unnecessary changes of setting, right? Where, I think because it takes the reader some time to immerse themselves in your setting, as Lucy was just saying, right? You're trying to communicate this whole world. I feel like when you just take that away from them and then put them immediately into a new setting, you really have to ask yourself, why am I doing this, and how is this change in setting serving the story, and where am I going, instead of just arbitrarily, have your character sort of walk through like 3 different settings in the space of like 10 pages. Just because of the cognitive load that it takes on the reader to like get themselves oriented each time.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think if by choosing too few settings or choosing a setting that's too restrictive, you can hamstring yourself a little bit. Like I'm in mind of Artemis, and it's all on the same moon base, and to me it started to feel a little claustrophobic as I was reading it. And she interacts with the setting in different ways, kind of based on her change in socioeconomic status. Like she gets more money, and so then she can stay in the really swanky hotel, and then she's on the lam, and so she has to sleep in like basically a coffin overnight.
Right.
And so those are interesting, but at the same time, I was like, when are we going to get out of this moon base?
We did get outside eventually. This is Artemis by Andy Weir, by the way. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. I recently read a really interesting book by Caitlyn Starling called The Luminous Dead, and it's all set. The main character is basically spelunking by herself through a cave, and she's in a suit, and her only link to the outside world. And it's like the setting is literally alive in this book. It's like one of the best parts of it. It's like I highly recommend it if you want to get an example of an immersive and character type setting that plays a huge role in a book. It's really well done. So what did we learn today?
Takeaways.
Well, I think the first one that came up is this idea that as the setting as a way to interpret the character, or as a way to enhance the POV, and way to sort of, how did you put it, Chelsea? You had a good word. Sort of like it's enhancing the character, or it's saying something, it's making a statement about the character. Yeah,
you look at what the character notices versus what they don't notice. So like in the sample of the runner that Chris read, so we only have Roger's POV. Roger's doing all the talking, but you can kind of pick up on what Granger's not noticing, because like the runner's head, all the cables, the drudges like lined up and because it's all covered in dust, it's obviously become the mess that he's stopped seeing. And so he's just kind of this disorderly, gross thing. And that dehumanizes the runners even further, because like he's forgotten that thing is there.
Right. And Roger is clearly uneasy about the whole setting.
Yeah. He's noticing every detail.
I think the other thing too, and you mentioned this before, Chelsea, is this idea that the setting needs to provide some kind of action, or it needs to be active, and it needs to be, Chris, you said it in the Starling example there, that it needs to be, in that case, it's alive. And I think that's an extreme example, but I think the setting does need to be vibrant on some level. And I'm using that, I don't mean it like it's got to glow, but you know what I mean? It has to have some kind of pulse to it, I guess. Yeah,
like you were saying, Anton, you can't just start the beginning of the scene with a list of the things that were in the room. Yeah,
or if they're in a field, like you can't, if you're just describing the field, it has to be some kind of reason that it looks the way it is. You're showing the reader these details for a reason, and that has to be active. It needs to be alive. It needs to be, and then it needs to also, Jane, you said it has to contribute to the story. It has to keep the story moving. Sorry to startle you like that.
It's taking a nap. Kidding.
And then I think the last one that is really important is this idea of complicating the plot as the setting. Again, it's if you think of the characters as foreground and the setting as background, it needs to not just be the background. It needs to be integral to the story. It needs to be this thing that gets woven in and out of the action, in and out of the conflict. And it needs to kind of, you said it before, Jane, like if you're just changing scenes just to change scenes, that's not doing anything. But if you're changing scenes and it's moving the story forward, if it's conflicting with the character, now your setting is really playing a part in your story.
It's creating obstacles as well.
Yes.
It's interesting to see an angry man drive through the city, it's even better to see an angry man drive through the city in the rain, or get stuck in a roadblock, because there's, it throws obstacles in the way, and it also throws answers in the way sometimes too.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you go back to the sort of the horror trope of the haunted house, the setting is this house that wants to kill the main character, or is we said as before, is an antagonist to the protagonist, and that's a terrific setting, and it's one that everyone's familiar with. And so if you can play with that and make it vibrant and active and part of the story, it makes the story that much stronger.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So, as our fellow genre writers, if you have a piece of art or some photography or even like a trip that inspired your setting, send us a picture on Twitter, and we'll retweet our favorites, and we can talk about it a little bit, and look forward to seeing it.
So that was the episode. This has been The Genre Hustle.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Genre Hustle. You can find us on our website, www.genrehustle.com, on Twitter @genrehustle, or on Instagram @genrehustle. Our podcast is available on all major streaming platforms, including YouTube. Be sure to like, subscribe, and send any feedback or suggestions our way. See you next time.